Now, the approach that we're taking asks 3 questions, and I'm not going to give you all the answers. But the first is, how do we structure the problem? And I think that's a real gap. We assume resilience is a universal property of all processes, and therefore all we need to do is pick a few things and it'll work. But actually those processes that we're dealing with can be simple, with simple management, in which cause and effect are well understood. Push it here with another 1 degree of temperature, as we saw with the CRS modeling. You get this kind of impact. That kind of impact can be mitigated with this kind of technology. The places where you can do that, this green and pleasant land in the valleys, are actually pretty few and pretty boring, although they're the ripe entry points for private sector. On the other hand, you get landscapes of chaos, where there is no history that you can observe that tells you what the present is or what the future will be. I was real pleased to hear about Aleppo. It was one of the benchmark studies of indicator-based adaptive capacity, interviewed 150 families, constructed a spider diagram with 6 dimensions of adaptive capacity, absolutely standard practice. Baseline 2010, Aleppo. End of history. That study is absolutely irrelevant to the historical chaos and therefore the construction of resilience into the future. So you need to know what that landscape looks like. Once you know that landscape, how you can characterize it, we use a 4x4 metric. Then you can start to design a measurement, observation, monitoring process, beacons that can be measured where you have value chains that can be measured, let's say, use cases of behavioral decision making, which are formal agile software. Somebody in the audience was mentioning that earlier. You can do behavioral modeling, even with agent-based modeling. And then you can start to construct we call it a dashboard. It's not just a set of data tools, but a view that the user starts to get a sense of where they fit, where the complexity is, where the boundaries and the beacons are that would allow them to move forward. So to me, the measurement problem isn't, do we have a metric? We have lots of metrics. But do we have a theory of change with guidance in terms of what approach and methodology and toolkit you would use in those very different situations? And then I think you can actually make some pretty good progress in very specific situations. But until you do that, you're going to continue with this floundering around key performance indicators and global readiness indicators because they can't be applied generically. I said earlier, I'm a real fan of this stuff, so don't, but it's the afternoon and we can be a little more aggressive.
Tom, thank you so much. Loren, would you like to go next? Excellent. Yeah. Loren Labovitch, who's the Director of the Emerging Market Growths and Partnerships of MWH Global. Be provocative.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. I think first I'll take my 30 seconds here to thank Joyce and the ND Gain team for inviting me and continuing to have me be part of this very important conversation. It's an honor to be here today. And you know, the work that ND Gain is doing, I think, is really, really important. And I want to applaud them. It's important because it's helping to advance the dialogue on adaptation, which is what we're doing here today. It's important because it's helping to mobilize investment where it's needed most. And it's important, I think, because it helps us understand where we individually can best contribute to such a global and complex set of problems, as Tom just eloquently laid out. So again, thank you for having me here today, and thank you for the good work that you guys do. My name is Loren Labovitch. I'm a Director of Emerging Market Growth for MWH Global. We are a global engineering and consulting firm specialized in water and natural resources for built infrastructure and the environment. We provide a range of engineering and design, management consulting, program management, and construction services for public and private clients all over the world. We are a global leader in water and wastewater and hydropower, and other environmental and infrastructure related services. And so we really are on the front lines in many ways of helping to address and reduce vulnerability and improve the readiness of the clients and the countries in which we work. And in particular, when I look at the ND Gain Index, for instance, we can make important contributions to access to water and access to sanitation, to water storage and conveyance, to helping to improve the stewardship of watersheds and energy resources, and even help out institutionally with respect to ensuring that there's good enabling environments that attract private sector investment into some of these issues. We as a company, I think, because we understand our role in this larger conversation, we are really trying to adjust the way that we do business and make sure that the services that we provide to our clients are responsive to the market needs and the needs of society in general. And therefore, even as really what is basically an engineering company at heart, and has a long, almost 200-year history doing so, we know we have to change going forward because we have to help with these issues. And part of what we're doing, strategically and very purposefully, is trying to think about being a more holistic solution provider, trying to be more oriented towards thinking about outcomes, not just the outputs of the work that we do, which is very much related to this conversation we're having today around monitoring and informed decision making. And we are trying to make it, an intrinsic part of how we go about addressing problems and solutions for our clients, as far as thinking about climate risk and vulnerability and how that affects the work that we do, the solutions that we provide, and the relationships that we foster over time with our clients. My role personally as a Director of Emerging Market Growth is to help grow and expand our international development and emerging market practice. And so with that, I'm looking to enhance our service offerings. I'm looking to broaden our client portfolio. And I'm looking to identify strategic partners, frankly, that that we can work with, not only for, in helping to address these issues. And I think the last thing I'll say that is in the international development space, even a company like MWH, and I think commonly we equate the international development market with donors, working for folks like KIT and USAID and other multilateral and bilateral donors. But one of the things that I'm trying to do at MWH is really understand that the international development space more and more is not just about working for the public sector or working for donors and governments. It's really about working with the private sector, either alongside or in direct partnership with, because so much of the investment and the technology and the thought leadership that is required and is being put forth to address adaptation and other big climate issues is being put forth more and more by the private sector. So when I think about our business in the future, and I think about our international development practice, it's not just about doing more work for USAID or AusAid or DFID or whatnot. It's really about partnering with the private sector as well. So thank you again, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Loren. Next, we have Anand Patwardan, Professor Patwardan, with the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and very happy to be here. I've been associated with GAIN. It's been a wonderful association for many years, ever since I got to know Jan Jose, and before GAIN became ND Gain, and I think that transition has been also a very positive one. In the spirit, I'm going to try and follow Tom. It's a very hard act to follow, but I'm going to try and do my best of being sort of provocative. I'd like to pose sort of two questions. One, it really comes to the question of the purpose. So, when we talk about measurement, there's lots of indicators around. You look around, you see, all this whole range of indicators. But I think the basic question is, what's the purpose? Why are we measuring? Very often, why the purpose tends to be to do with monitoring and accountability. Right? It has to do with a lot of the M&E systems, a lot of the tracking tools, whether it's of the World Bank, it's the GEF, it's bilateral agencies, are really focused around the question of accountability and where has funding gone, for what purpose. I think the larger question, though, is which I think is perhaps as important, if not more important, than the objective of accountability, is the objective of learning. Tom showed this very nice picture of the complicated, complex, and chaotic landscape. And if that's the landscape in which you're operating, then you really need to be able to learn from every dollar that you're investing. Behind every intervention, there is a hypothesis about whether that intervention works or not, whether it will produce the result that you expect or not. And so in some sense, one of the objectives of measurement really needs to be, are we able to draw that learning from what we are doing? Because for sure, one of the things that climate change forces us to recognize is that the past is not a good benchmark analogy for the future. If we are going to be moving into essentially untested, unknown waters, then we need to be able to learn as we do. Because otherwise we will simply be, repeating mistakes, which will have a very long lead time to figure out that it was in fact a mistake. So I just wanted to emphasize that in some sense, that might suggest that, well, every project needs to have a learning objective as much as any other kind of objective, and that needs to be sort of built in from the ground up. The second broad question, I think, comes to the issue not so much of the purpose, but what is it that we are measuring? And in the previous panel, Steve talked about the lack of insurance in the emerging markets in the developing world, and in fact that is true. So a lot of the estimates that you see are essentially for either mortality or insured loss. Why? Because those are two things that are easy to measure. So we are measuring what's easy to measure, but what we are not measuring is essentially everything below the tip of the iceberg. There's an entire array of effects in terms of uninsured losses, in terms of what communities, households, and others experience from hazards, which are real but don't appear, and so we have no idea of even what we are managing, and in a sense, until we have learned the ability to measure it. The corollary to that, of course, is because these effects are real, even if they don't show up, there is an entire array of private adaptation which we are also not recognizing. So the moment we talk about adaptation, we are talking about building a seawall, large public infrastructure. It's really the state that's kind of driving it. But the reality is there is a whole array of responses to climate risks that is happening already at every scale, from individuals to households to communities. So in some of the work we have done in cities in the developing world, in Mumbai, for example, what is the first thing that anyone living in an apartment does if you're living on the ground floor of an apartment building in a flood-prone area? Well, the first thing that you do is you raise your toilet, because the first thing that happens when you have a flood is that the sewer system backs up and the water comes back into your house. Now, this is, one might say, well, this is a trivial thing, but this is, there's an entire array of these responses that are already happening, and we have no idea. We're not capturing their costs, we're not capturing their effectiveness, we have no idea what the spillover effects are. If every housing society raises their lot, what does that do to the neighboring lot? So that's, so I think the second broad point I wanted to leave you with is this whole question of what are we measuring, and I'll argue that we're in fact not measuring much of what we should be. And so I'd like to then just wrap up with some sort of bring it back to GAIN. And to me, one of the strengths of GAIN has always been this emphasis on the readiness aspect. I mean, I think that is one of the more fascinating ideas behind this broader construct, is to try and build a better understanding of what constitutes readiness. Now, how do we think about that idea? And what are the determinants? It's economic, it's technology, it's social capital. So I think there's a lot of interesting insights into how that axis is constructed, which might actually be very useful now as countries start thinking about strategy at the national level. If I'm thinking about my strategy for adaptation, perhaps the readiness index, that readiness component, can provide me some idea how to doing a self-assessment. How do I use that construct to figure out, where am I in that space, which elements are weak, which elements are strong, and sort of use that as an input, in a sense, for strategy and planning. So that's sort of like to stop there, and I hope we'll get more time in the discussion.
Thank you so much. You raised a lot of the questions I think we'll want to circle back to in our discussion. Next, we have Conor Riffle, Director of the Cities and Data Product Innovation for CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project.
That's correct. That's correct. Thank you so much, Jennifer, and great to be with all of you today, and big thanks to ND GAIN. I'm Conor Riffle, and I run the Cities program and our data product innovation work at CDP. I've been there about 4 years now, based in London. We provide a reporting platform for the world's largest companies and cities to report on what they're doing on climate change, water, and forests. Over the last 4 years, we've really built up our work with city governments, and we're asking now more than 200 city governments around the world every year to tell us what they're doing to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change. We ask questions of cities like, have you done a risk assessment? If so, what methodology did you use to do a risk assessment? What effects of climate change are you already seeing in your city? What effects of climate change do you anticipate seeing in your city in the future? What do you think the timescale of those risks are? And how severe do you think they are? So we're right on the front lines of this question of what is the appropriate thing to measure. And I just want to mention very briefly, because I really am keen for discussions and questions from everybody, but just a few of the problems we're running into in this experiment to provide this platform for city governments. I mean, one of them is obviously, especially in developing countries, just the capacity issue, capacity to adapt to climate change, and capacity then to measure any indicators and provide those indicators to the international community is just really lacking. And I think this is reflected in the GAIN index as well, and seeing a lot of those developing countries at the top of the vulnerability part of the index. I think we see that firsthand in just the difficulty that cities have in gathering this data and actually doing any of the work. We also see a lot of problems around methodologies. There aren't enough good, robust risk assessment methodologies that city governments can use to figure out, hey, if I want to do a self-assessment, what indicators do I look at? What data do I go for? Which data do I request from all these different departments? So we run into that problem a lot. We ask cities to tell us what methodology they use for their risk assessment every year, and every year the most common methodology is other. So it's kind of a wide world out there of different options. There are a couple of solutions. I just want to suggest a couple off the top, and we can talk more about this. But one of the things that we found is that oftentimes cities, especially in developing countries, don't necessarily have an incentive to manage issues of climate change adaptation or climate change risk. The threat of some risk 30 years down the line isn't necessarily enough to prompt them to take action this year. So we find that the process of just inviting them to report every year on that is a big driver of action. So once they see, okay, hey, the international community wants this data, they're interested in what we're doing, maybe it's something we should take a look at. I think that we've found that has a really important sort of catalyzing effect on the city taking action. The other thing is this idea of annual measurement, I think, is really critical. I think a lot of the measurement, especially going back 10 years around mitigation, happens every 5 years, because that's the only time that a city can pull together the measurement process. And it's very difficult to see trends. It's very difficult to see red flags when you only measure once every 5 years. So the annual nature of measurement going forward, and if we can eventually get there, moving to kind of a biannual or even a quarterly approach, I think is really something for us to take a look at. And the last thing I want to say, which just what you guys said reminded me, is this idea of kind of focusing not just on outputs but also on outcomes, as you mentioned, Loren, and also the purpose, as you mentioned, on why we're measuring, I think is really important. And we've found that it's not just about reporting so that we can all take the data back and show our bosses, hey, they're making progress, but also that the process of reporting can be both a catalyst for taking more action and can be useful for the reporting entity itself. And we've proven this over and over with companies in asking them to measure their sustainability. And we're starting to see it with cities as well. Just the process of taking the time to fill out a questionnaire or take the time to measure one or two indicators across the city is a useful exercise for the organization, and one that in itself drives change. I'll leave it there. Thanks. So delighted to be here and looking forward to your questions.
That's great. Well, why don't we pick right up with what Anand first put on the table, which is measuring. Are we measuring the right things? What aren't we measuring that we ought to be? What are we measuring that maybe isn't as important to measure? And also, I think, what are the links between what you're measuring for which purpose? So open it, Tom and Loren especially, to lead off.
Do you have the answer?
We have to go to the audience.
I got all the answers.
The audience has the answer.
A crack at that one.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question, but when I think about what we need to measure that we're not, I mean, we're measuring so much. In so many ways, we're measuring a lot. It's just making sense of it all, as so many others have said. But eventually, with time, I mean, what I think is going to be really important is this idea of ex post impact evaluations, which in the donor community from whence I came, and spent many years working with, and even when you look at the social impact investors, so the impact investing community, which they have a task force now. They're trying to tackle this question of measuring and monitoring and impact evaluation. But eventually, these type of rigorous impact evaluations over time, I think, are going to be really important. And maybe we're not there yet to have enough projects and investments underway to do it. But these things will help validate the types of investments and the costs and benefits of what we're doing. They'll help us understand attribution. Get a better understanding of what really works, the causality of certain things that we're doing to try to build resilience or help folks adapt. It provides lessons learned that we can, all learn from and then adjust how we go forward. And I think the process of impact evaluation also helps to foster transparency and a participatory discussion and planning process because most of the impact evaluations, the purpose is really to make that data public. And so I think that's really important. A couple other things that come to mind. I mean, one, something that I don't think's been talked about too much today, but the gender disaggregated data. In the developing world, anyway, I think this is really, really important because the idea of helping to reduce vulnerabilities and enhance the resilience of communities to, severe storms and immediate impacts, and then the longer range changes in climate and variability. There's a real important social dynamic that has to be understood in communities, especially in developing countries. That and gender is one dynamic; it's not the only dynamic, but again, gender disaggregated data is something that the development community uses and is increasingly putting more attention towards. And even in the private sector, again, when I think about what we have to do to be more responsive to our clients, to provide more holistic solutions, to think in a more outcome-oriented way, understanding the different roles between women and men with respect to their access to natural resources and their use of those resources, even things like property rights and things like that, I think is really important. So I'll put that out there. And then I think lastly, the one more point I'll raise here is that when it comes to, pushing the dialogue around things that we need to measure that maybe we're not today, I do think that some of these policy measures and public-private partnerships that the last panel talked about are important. Mm-hmm. So the executive order that the president just, released a couple months, or Climate Week, is important because it's forcing all of the agencies, international development or domestic, to think about climate risks and vulnerability in a way that we're getting better at, but it's now requiring the international development agencies to screen for climate risk before they approve an investment. That means that when they come hire a company like MWH or AECOM or others to help them assess this stuff, we have to provide the services to help them do that. And so there's a domino effect there. The World Bank has put similar policies in place for their next round of funding for IDA 17. They're requiring a climate risk and screening process before those investments are brought to the board. IFC is doing similar things. So these kind of policy shifts matter, and they have a domino effect, and I think that over time they will help create an imperative to measure and monitor in a way that we're not necessarily doing today.
Now I'll jump in. So I was tempted to tell you that everything he said is wrong, but that might not be the best place to start here. What we came to in thinking about these journeys and navigation is it's a very simple construct. It was out there. Richard Klein had probably the best implementation of it. But the notion of an adaptation continuum. So where do you start? Well, you start with good practice that exists in development, if we're talking development, resource management. And we've seen a lot of that. And we've seen a lot of people come into this market repackaging good development as resilience and then as climate change in the longer term adaptation. And that's okay if that's only where you're starting. Now, one of the things we do in our company is technical assistance, technical advice. We created the climate safeguard system for the African Development Bank. So our tool is screening $1 billion a year of investment projects already. It's inside their firewall. It's fully trained and operational. And then we're providing some advice. Some people pay for it, some pay less for it, for portfolios that are around $300 million at the moment. Everyone starts with good development. You've got to start there. You've got to start where you are. But you want to design your measurement, your accountability, your tracking to scale up as you go. The next step is obviously reducing the impact of current disasters, current events, event-based climate impacts. Not difficult. We've had 20 years of international disaster risk management programs. They've solved that. Yeah, not really. They're still hashing over pretty much the same stuff they did when I started in the business in Boulder, Colorado. Then the next step is we call it increasing resilience. It's scanning the next 5 years. You do a lot of seasonal climate forecasting. Think about trends, think about the disruptors, think about the kinds of processes where you already are on that road. You can't do any path-breaking things. But then beyond that, beyond the next 10 years, beyond the next 20 years, up to, say, the next 30 years, you're looking for transformation. Transformation came into, I've been in all of the IPCCs, it came into the special report on extreme events for the first time through the back door last chapter. Some people pushed it in. It's in the AR5 in a couple of places, but with some backlash because people don't know what it means. But that's what you're trying to get to, path-breaking visions of the future that you can do that. Metrics have to account for all of that. Cost-benefit analysis with discounting, good for well-constrained problems, but how do you build a portfolio or screen a set of projects so you know across, say, 30 different attributes you're interested in what their potential is to break free of the development paradigm and transform the sector. And so that's the kind of toolkit that I think is going to lead to aggressive transformation in the business. But we got to start with everything you said. I agree 100%.
Anand and Conor want to...
Well, I just was going to maybe propose 2 questions that you could ask yourself if you wanted to find out if you're collecting the right data or if you're measuring the right thing. The first question I would suggest is, does it help the people that you're asking for it from? Does it help them to manage climate risk better? It might be fine that you go and you have the data and you can deliver it to your boss or to your donors or anyone else, but is the data that you're collecting, aside, if you threw that out, is it helping the people that are actually collecting the data and doing that analysis? So I think that's a really important question to ask. The second question is, are people falling all over themselves to get your data? Like, are people like banging down your door to get that data that you collected? And if the answer is no, you're not there yet, right? And I think the really great example of this is Climate Corp, which was sold to Monsanto for $1 billion. Once they harness weather data and all this stuff to show farmers how they could basically grow more crops in their fields. Farmers were literally banging down Climate Corp's door to get access to their analytics. That's how you build a $1 billion company. That's how you're on the right track. And I think in climate change and adaptation, we got to ask ourselves the same question. Like, and it's an iterative process. You might, if no one's banging into it right now, great, but keep trying. Keep tweaking it. Eventually, you're going to get there, hopefully. And I think you'll know it when you get there.
That's a great point.
So just 2 things. I think we've had some very good inputs, and I don't disagree with what has been said. Just 2 points I wanted to make. One is I wanted to echo something that Conor said, which is about the value of the process in addition to just in what is reported. I think that is really a source of value because it's a source of self-assessment and it's a source of discovery about even realizing what risks you face. So I think even thinking of it from that point of view is something worthwhile for us to keep in mind. The other idea I wanted to leave with is that at the end of the day, the question comes, we might come up with lots of lists of things we want to measure, but the question will be, how do we do it? And there I think the challenge for the adaptation community is going to be to see how can we connect with the existing systems of measuring and monitoring socioeconomic data within countries, whether it's the census, whether it's consumption surveys, whether it's sample surveys, whether it's, there's a whole array of existing structures and processes for measuring and tracking a whole range of socioeconomic characteristics. And of course, one of the challenges that we'll immediately face in many developing countries, those are not there. So it's not even a question of saying, whether we are collecting the right data or not. Maybe the data is not there itself because those systems are not there. We don't have a way of measuring what even we want to measure. So I think the challenge, though, for our community is going to be to figure out how do we make those connections with existing systems. In some cases, maybe we have to actually strengthen them or modify them. But I think that's a very interesting aspect which we might want to think about.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Go ahead, Tom.
Anand and I wrote a paper in the seminal protocol on how to adapt to climate change, Adaptation Policy Framework, a long time ago. Everybody got that on your desk? Disappeared. We did vulnerability benchmarking. And sometime after that, I think I was noodling with, we call it noodling now, I guess we were brainstorming, and asked Anand, why doesn't that work, vulnerability benchmarking? And he said, well, the problem is the value of information. And that's the model we should be using. The value of the information is in making a decision, not in having a risk assessment, but having it connected to a decision process. And we take that central, but it just occurred to me as you were talking that the value of information and monitoring and measuring is not in having that benchmark, but in making that decision. For a while, I sat on a long time ago, the crop forecasting committee in the government of Kenya. And the most important important information. Wasn't the statistical surveys, the air photos, they had all of that. It was the PS coming back from his homeland, which is in the highlands, and saying, their crops are everywhere, or nothing's growing. And that triggered the committee to alter their assessment. Yeah, sort of.
And I think that's a great segue to another question, which is about the scale of the data that's being collected. And a lot of what ND Gain does, a lot of other data that we have is at the national level or the continental level. A lot of the adaptation decisions that have to be made are at the local level. What can we do about that? What are the ways to bridge that gap? Or how do you see that as a problem in the work that you do? Cities.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the clear answer on, at least from our perspective, is definitely that the more granular, the better. I think, national governments and using government kind of jurisdictional areas at the national level, the regional level, and then the city level is a really good kind of structure for how to structure your data. But we'll see it go far beyond that. I definitely see climate change adaptation data taking a similar trajectory that we've had with corporate sustainability data and that we've had with city mitigation and greenhouse gas emissions data, which is that every year it gets more granular and it gets better. I think it's on that road, and we're going to start to see it filter down. We already are from national to regional and state, and then to city, and then even to the neighborhood level.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this is again. One of the challenges of measurement is if you're measuring something, you got to be able, you can actually resolve the signal in the noise. Otherwise, you're measuring at a level where you can't see what's happening, and that is a challenge. And I think one of the solutions. So there's a couple of things we might need to think about. One is how do we actually make the existing data collection processes more robust, because they are also difficult. The other is, are there non-traditional sources of information? I mean, are there, crowdsourced reports of things working or not working? I mean, how can one sort of connect and some of this might not have the same level of, rigor as, let's say, official statistics, or it's coming in through a variety of different forms. But I think we are going to have to deal with, figure out how to deal with data of that kind. So I think that's another potentially interesting source of information.
Can you give an example of useful crowdsourcing of data?
So, for instance, you can think of people self-reporting about the state of the infrastructure. Capturing it, sending out messages or posting photos. So you could have, there are lots of informal surveys that are often done, which are very quickly done. They're not very rigorous or scientifically based, but they give you sort of these quick snapshots of what's happening. So I think sort of you have data coming in at different temporal resolutions. So some of this is quick stuff, doesn't give you a lot, then it gives you something. Then you have to combine that in a sense. So you've got a problem of, in a sense, of assimilating data from different sources. Conor mentioned that a lot of the reporting naturally follows jurisdictional lines. Very often you want to match what comes from a jurisdictional or an administrative boundaries with spatial data, which has a different way it is structured. So I think there are lots of these questions of how do you merge and assimilate information, which are going to be important.
I would imagine that also going into areas of mining big data or how to use social media to gather information may also be useful down the road. The way they look at things like how much cough syrup are people buying to know where flu is breaking out,
right.
Stuff like that. So, comments on this?
Yeah, on the crowdsourcing data, I've seen with respect to water systems anyway, you can use that pretty effectively to determine where there's leaking pipes and things like that. And so if you're working with the utility, and again, I'm thinking in more the developing world context, but if you're working with the utility to try to reduce non-revenue water, And in certain countries and communities where a lot of the water infrastructure is not necessarily below ground, and you can virtually see your non-revenue water running down the driveways of homes, you know, that kind of geo-reference data click on a phone can be used really effectively. But yeah, let me just say too, on the scale of the data, I mean, this is something MWH is doing a fair amount of work right now. We work with a lot of different utilities and municipalities all over the world. And for instance, we have a team, risk and resilience team out of Australia that is really, I think, you know, leading a lot of the thinking within our company about how you work with municipalities to take, you know, some of the work and the concepts of ND gain or what CDP does at a bigger scale and take that down to a community level. And so we actually work with some of our clients to develop community risk profiles. And it's usually to look at one aspect, for instance, floodplains or flood management. And so to take these concepts of vulnerability and readiness or, you know, something like that, and we produce, you know, one-pagers that help the community see where the highest needs, lowest cost, you know, investments are, then, you know, high need, high cost, you know, lower need, lower cost, that kind of thing. And, you know, one of the things that I'm now working on with these guys is how do we bridge from, you know, Australia or New Orleans to, you know, to Indonesia or Senegal, you know, because the data, the availability of data, the availability to do that, where the need, the value of the information to inform decisions, as you rightfully said, Tom, is there. But the ability to get the data is much more challenging. And the credibility and reliability of the data is really important. So, and on some level, I think it takes maybe, you know, using lower quality data just to get the conversation going in certain instances. But that's where the conversation needs to go. And again, I think a lot of the work that's been done at larger scales is now, you know, we're looking at it. How can we replicate that at either, you know, a city scale or, you know, with water, you really have to think with respect to watersheds. So sometimes it's not just administrative boundaries of a community. You really have to think in terms of a landscape. And so you want to downscale the data on a landscape level. But anyway, that's, you know, we're doing our best to advance the conversation anyway.
That's great.
I think there's an enormous upside to this part of the conversation, but what I'm interested in is how that data becomes information and management of the solution, rather than how an NGO might capture a data stream and then insert itself as the broker that delivers the solution, or even a company like mine. One of the people that I know reasonably well got a job 5-6 years ago with Vodafone as a product manager for their M-Pesa scheme. M-Pesa is money in Swahili, and it's a cell phone to cell phone microfinance transfers that's hugely successful, particularly in economies where the banking system is weak. DFID, the UK Department for International Development, paid Vodafone £1 million, I think it was probably 10 years ago, to develop that technology. Return on investment, although they don't get that, well, they get it in taxes, probably 100-fold. One of the best products is a Danish company has built the M-Pesa system inside an irrigation pump. The pump, kind of expensive, but a cooperative would buy it, get some finance, put it in place. If you want to irrigate, you send with the text message to the pump, I'm ready, here's my account, take out 100 cubic meters, I have no idea of the units here, and I'll get sugarcane or whatever they're, cotton, whatever they're growing. If the pump breaks, that management unit have the money in the pump to get it fixed. And every day it's not fixed, they're losing money. So the information in terms of efficiency and demand and risk in terms of the climate weather effects on irrigation demand is internalized in a private sector technology that leads to a management response that's 90% performance, very little downtime, compared to donor provision of water pumps in Africa. You're lucky if you get 50% efficiency in terms of downtime. After 2 years. They break after 2 years.
Tom, in your opening remarks, your example with Aleppo talked about an example of where the data in the past doesn't necessarily help you go forward. I think there's a question I'd love the panel's thoughts on, which is sort of questions of predictive analytics. Are there best practice predictive analytics out there that are helpful for the adaptation community to learn from, or other thoughts you have on how to address this challenge? Or elaborate on how it's a challenge in your work.
Well, I would just say that I almost think, in thinking about this question, I almost think that when we're talking about climate change adaptation and risk from climate change, all of our analytics are predictive. I mean, it's about trying to forecast the future, right? So everything we do, in a way, is focused around how can we try to the extent possible predict how this massive environmental change is going to affect my particular local community or my business or whatever I'm interested in. So it strikes me that everything is predictive. I almost wonder if the lagging indicators aren't actually more effective in helping us kind of win the business case and win the argument that we have to fight to get the resources to act on this, because it's anything in the future comes with a little bit of uncertainty, but lagging indicators that show, for instance, hey, last year was a wild weather year, or we had all these big changes last year that we weren't expecting, or one of the ones that we ask cities is what effects of climate change have you seen in your city in the last year? That's really powerful because it's no longer, it takes it out of the realm of being a hypothetical and makes it real. So, I don't know that necessarily answers your question, and I'm sure there are some really important predictive analytic tools that the rest of the panel knows about. But I do think the kind of the recent past is actually really helpful in helping us win our arguments.
So 2 points, and this is really good question, because in some sense this is a challenge, right? So you are looking at a future which is uncertain, and I think we can sometimes make too much of uncertainty because it's often seen as a way of saying, well, there's so much uncertainty that you can't really do anything. But I think one way of looking at the problem is what you're looking for is not exactness. You're not looking for prediction in that sense, but you're looking for robustness. That is, you're looking to see whether, in broad terms, your decision is robust under a range of future possibilities. So it's not necessarily a problem of finding an exact solution, and which is in many cases impossible. You're never going to have that degree of certainty in climate projections anyway. But sort of converting it more into a question of robustness, of saying, well, at what point will you end up having to change a decision? And the other sort of analytical tool, which I think is very helpful, is really that you need to combine then your climate outlooks or climate outcomes with socioeconomic futures. And there I think scenarios can be a very useful tool, again, for asking exactly those questions of at what point in time will sort of going off into a different trajectory. Because I think one of the important challenges is in figuring out when we are looking at, over a 20, 30, 50-year time horizon, at what point will we have a very different baseline. And so, trying to think about that in sort of scenario terms, that under what conditions will we actually start having a different pattern of development in the city is, for instance, is important sort of addition to just looking at it, the climate outcomes.
Yeah, the way I was going to answer this question is basically bring up the scenario planning, because I think there's a lot of predictive analytics that, look, we're predicting weather and predicting finance and economics and markets and demographic trends, and so all those things are and should continue to inform the predictive analyses that we do with respect to climate change. But and sort of building off the panel previous to us, I think maybe more so that the ability to do some good scenario analysis, robust, almost game theory, like the military does. And I spent 9 years working in the U.S. government before joining MWH a couple months ago. And in some of the work I got to do there on climate change, I worked with agencies across the government, including DOD and CIA even and whatnot. And, that question of how do you do scenario analysis may be the more relevant type of analysis that we need, because you're not going to predict it with precision. Like you said, you can't just say, this is what it's going to be, let's manage to that. You have to manage across a variety of scenarios, understand probability and an impact and all those kind of things, and really make decisions around that. So having real robust scenario analysis may be where we can really learn from and leverage the most.
Very good thought.
I spent a year on a panel with a guy who's on the British Monetary Policy Committee. They're the ones who set the interest rates, or the Bank of England rates. It's a very qualitative process. They got all the numbers. And it comes down in some cases, well, the committee was split 4-2 and the chairman overruled 1, so we decided we didn't have a quorum to change the policy. And I'm a great fan of qualitative metrics. A AAA bond is better than a AA bond, but it's not 10% better. It's a whole different argument around the evidence that they have of the change. But I think this point that those kinds of qualitative understandings come out best in a scenario analysis. And that came up earlier in the insightful interventions from our organizers. And one of the things I've questioned, I've proposed, there are no scenarios of adaptive futures. There's scenarios of emissions. Those are pretty well done. Lots of argument about them. A lot of scenarios of vulnerability, a lot of scenarios of big development drivers. But when you ask these questions that we're doing today and the readiness, is there a core set of scenarios that are very qualitative, very contextual, very actor-specific and grounded? There aren't any. We make them up as we go, but there isn't this grounding, and yet I think it's a way we can get very big benefits in relative measurement of the adaptive pathways.
That's great. That's great. I would like to open it now to questions from the audience.